governance, among other principles or factors. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Clarissa Widoven, and this is another rendezvous of Global Insight, your informative and discursive program. And of course, the narratives have shifted and continue to shift across the globe and across every sphere. How is this shift felt across the African continent, especially under the Ubuntu philosophy championing Pan Africanism? Africa's ambitious blueprint agenda of transformation, which is the Agenda 2063, a vision born from the collective aspirations of the African leaders. We are talking from the time of the organization of the African Union to the present year African Union. And of course, we are looking at how this vision can better suit or help leaders across the continent solve very mutual or continental issues that will present position the continent at its level. And of course, this initiative therefore aims to steer the continent towards a prosperous, integrated, and peaceful future by the year 2063. But then we still ask the question, if we're going to wait for 2063 to start entering into force or practically under the umbrella of the African Union, the dictates of this Agenda 2063. And of course, with a panel of experts, we are going to decode what Agenda 2063 is. We look at the preamble and see if all the points highlighted in 2015 when the agenda was launched. I think when South Africa's Dlamini Zuma was acting as the African Union Commission chair. We want to look at the dynamics of 2015 and the dynamics of 2025 to see if actually they're still very much relevant in wanting to meet all these the dictates of the continental free trade area. Without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to acknowledge and welcome this panel of experts that we have today to elaborate and give more insight on this topic. Africa Agenda 2063. How achievable or attainable has it been? And of course, what is the way forward, taking up us to the second decade of the flagship agenda. And now let's go straight away to Algeria and welcome Professor Lait Zaglami, who is Algiers University Faculty of Information and Communication. You're welcome, sir, and it's a pleasure having you on today's edition of Global Insight.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Good afternoon to you, Clarence, for having me on our program. I'm so pleased and delighted to be part of this webinar today. Good afternoon also to Mrs. Najat, to Arthur and Harry. Of course, we have to remind ourselves that Agenda 2063 are the basic principle for Africa we want. And of course, at the top of the agenda are a prosper Africa, are secure Africa, are ambitious Africa, and Africa which has a say in the world affairs. That's basically what is the main objective of this agenda. And all African African Union were gathered to discuss this ambitious program. Of course, we are 2025. We are, of course, behind about I would say 18 years to get 28 years to get close to 2063, and it is not easy. But hope and ambitious and expectation are there. So it is important to mention that. Our leader, African leader, have marked this agenda for the progress for Africa to have a say and to have a role to play in the world affairs. We cannot wait anymore to be sidelined from the world business, and that's why I am so pleased to discuss this matter, even though, again, as I said to you, it's still a long way to reach, but hopes are that.
Okay. And thank you for giving importance to such a rendezvous, Professor, as we continue to talk the issues affecting the African continent and how we can make the Africa we want using our own initiatives. We also acknowledge the presence of Alton Mobley, a journalist, historian, and IEC Lawyers Guide observer. He's joining us from Arizona in the United States of America. Good morning to you and welcome to today's edition of Global Insight, dear Alton.
Good morning, Clarice, and thank you for the invitation and looking forward to the conversation.
Indeed, looking forward to having a constructive conversation that will continue to help to widen the horizon of all Africans and actually educate us on the particular roles that we need to play as Africans despite our different maybe portfolios towards attaining these developmental agenda actually under the auspices of the African Union. And we are going back to North Africa, to Tunisia particularly, to welcome Najet Zamouri, who is a distinguished professor and pedagogy consultant activist. You are welcome, madam.
Thank you so much, Clarice. So good evening, good morning. I'd like to thank you again for for the invitation and for the very, very interesting topics that you usually choose. So I'm going to revisit the preamble of the vision. To revisit it, the preamble is, I quote, "We are determined to eradicate poverty in one generation and build shared prosperity through social and economic transformation," end of the quote. So the preamble here of Agenda 2063 is more than just a political introduction. In my point of view, it's a declaration of a new African dream. It draws strength from the continent's history of liberation struggles, from anti-colonial resistance to Pan-African unity movements. It pledges to learn from the past, build on progress, and move toward an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. This is indeed a bold and Pan-African commitment. Why? Because it centers African ownership, not externally imposed solutions. It envisions a continent where the rights, for example, of women and youth are fully realized, where participatory democracy flourishes, and where social and economic justice are no longer aspirations, but everyday realities. This vision is powerful because it links the political, economic, cultural, and social spheres, calling from transformation across all sectors, from governance, and trade to gender equality and heritage preservation. But today, more than 10 years into the implementation of Agenda 2063, we must ask difficult questions. We should be courageous to ask these questions. Are African citizens truly at the center of development and policy making? Are our leaders accountable to their people or to international financial institutions? Are women's rights being advanced or pushed to the margins in the name of security or traditions? Are we really building unity or entrenching divisions? I think to answer these questions, we must examine the disconnect between the agenda's ambitions, rhetoric, and national level realities, which I will maybe speak about afterwards.
Very imperative, taking every aspect critically and seeing how this is going to help to align with the dream of having the Africa we want. And now let's go to the political capital of the Republic of Cameroon. We're being joined by Henry Kwam, founder and executive director, Cameroon Economic Institute. It's a pleasure having you this day as we continue to discuss Africa's Blueprint Agenda 2063 with probably a focus of that will look at the economy, particularly the African continental free trade area and other stakes that pertains to this very important development agenda.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Ms. Clarice. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and also to discuss with my co-panelists. Good morning to your viewers and good morning to my co-panelists. I would just like to, rather than reiterate what Professor Laid and Dr. Najit have already spoken about, I would like to just reiterate that this flagship project, of course, in its entirety reflects Africa's self-determination for unity, freedom, and collective prosperity. And like she said, of course, the rhetoric is encompassing and reflects everything that Africans want: inclusive and sustainable development, economic integration and political unity, a cultural renaissance, Africa becoming strong and influential on the global stage. All of this is very good. But from CEPI's standpoint, it's also important to note that whilst quite a bit of progress has been made, a lot remains to be done. Because since it was agreed upon or approved back in 2013, over 38 out of the 55 African Union member states have now integrated the Agenda 23 into their national and regional strategies. So I think that is that's a plus, and that's not something that is achieved easily, because it is Africa is very diverse, and so I think that alone shows that we are taking some steps, although the steps are quite slow. When it comes to macroeconomic growth, of course, growth hasn't changed from where it was back in 2012 and 2013. Africa grew back then at 4% on an annual basis, and Africa is still growing around 4% on an annual basis, which means that a lot more has to be done to ensure that we become much more integrated, we accelerate economic transformation, and we move beyond the rhetoric of global trade about leveraging competitive advantage to actually making sure that countries identify their strengths and utilize these strengths. If you allow, I think before we dissect the agreement, this Agenda 2063, we should also note that progress has been made in terms of reducing maternal and child mortality rates across the continent. But that in itself isn't only due to the Agenda 2063, although the agenda has shaped healthcare policy. A lot of that is due to Africa's reliance on international partners and donors such as the United States and Canada specifically. Now, just before I give the floor to my co-panelists, if I may, the way the African Union is funded has been organized and orchestrated such that every single country has the ability and the capacity to contribute. Now, of course, this is just to remind your viewers that the African Union is funded in 3 tiers, right? There is tier 1, where these countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco are responsible for about 9.6% of total financing. There is 48% of the total financing. That is, they provide about 9.6% each. Tier 2 is made up of countries like Ghana, Ethiopia, Angola, who contribute about 37% of the total. And then you have Tier 3, made up of the smallest economies that contribute 15% of the total. Now, so the African Union is funded. However, we still rely on generous donations from partners across the world, whether it's Germany or the United Nations or China when it comes to infrastructure and some institutional support, the United States when it comes to AU health projects, the United Nations for peacekeeping operations, and the European Union for, who funds the majority for AU peacekeeping operations and other initiatives around digitization. So it's important if we want sovereignty, we can't call for sovereignty only through agendas. It's important for us to think about how to ensure the financing of the African Union can become much more indigenous and stable to ensure that we can truly shape the agenda across the continent.
For African stakeholders or Africans to be at the forefront of ensuring the practicality or the realization of developmental agendas, which of course 2063 is that very blueprint agenda that a lot of people across the continent have been talking about, and we want to look at how this agenda is even helping in the development of human capital. We are going to continue the conversation with you ultimately. Just to note that this program was brought to you by Globus, and of course we continue to analyze the stakes shaping Africa and the global world and see how Africa can utilize constructively its competitive edge to be able to attain continental agendas while ensuring that the continent also probably has a very fertile international relations that makes it a master actually in the international dynamics. You are welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. Now to you ultimately, we know that the African diaspora has been very intentional about wanting to contribute to the development of the continent at every sphere, and we know that this is a flagship agenda that has been bought by a whole lot of people, which actually talked about Ubuntu and the philosophy of Pan-Africanism. In your perspective as an African diaspora, what do you think is maybe the Agenda 2063? Is it realistic towards attaining the Africa that we really want?
Well, of course, any efforts to organize on a continental level are productive, and I applaud the African Union for coming up with this blueprint, and it gives us a baseline to take and say we're going to forecast 40 years into the future. And we are going to project that we are going to reach by increments some level of unity that will finally result in the Africa we want. And that certainly has to be something that we have to define more clearly. The Africa that we want. What
Absolutely.
do we want for Africa in the next 10 years, much less looking 40 years into the future? But I think that we have to be careful. There is an international effort afoot to recolonize a lot of those areas of the world that have been previously colonized, and Africa is no exception. So I've watched a lot of the input to the Agenda 2063 over the years, as well as the morphing of the African Union from its roots as the Organization for African Unity into what it is today. And I see a distinct pattern of European influence and American influence that I think is going to potentially disrupt, if not impede, what Africa's developmental objectives are. I think we need to be very open, need to be very candid, and we need to be very forthright in how we address these threats. And that's a historic threat. We've looked at what Europe and the United States, and particularly Western countries, have done to prevent the development of African sovereignty, African unity, African Ubuntu, and African liberation, if you will. So that is always going to be in the background. and we need to be very cautious about how we proceed as African people to address these challenges for Africa, but let's make it an African agenda. Let's make it one where we can truly say, this is the Africa that we want.
It's to really define what the Africa we want is. And in the same perspective with you, Professor Laid, we're still in the contextual understanding of this flagship agenda and how probably we can be more intentional to ensuring that the successes that we record during the second decade will be more visible to the entire continent. And we now want to look at the success metrics. Can probably you maybe provide some specific countries that have been instrumental. I know people have always cited Ethiopia, Botswana, Rwanda as among the countries that have been, functioning using the guidelines of the African Agenda 2063. So let's again understand from you how practical countries have been in across Africa, the successes that have been recorded, and also to see if the agenda is meant to be at national level or continental level. Is it projects that are supposed to mastermind it by the African Union or individual countries under the guidelines of the Development Agenda 2063?
Well, to start with, we have to be clear that Agenda 2063 is at the responsibility of all African country, and of course with the leadership and the monitoring of the African Union. So having said that, maybe so many people are not realistic. They say Agenda 2063, as I said to you earlier, is another 38 years ahead. But of course, it is maybe surrealism, I would say even a political romanticism. But I would say we have to be optimistic for the future of this continent. We cannot leave aside or left aside while the whole world is changing. And as you know, the geopolitical card of the world has changed, and Africa, as so many experts and analysts predict, they say it's the continent of the future for the whole world. And therefore, we should take this opportunity, seize this opportunity to implement what we have as maybe today they are dreams, but tomorrow they are realities. So of course there are so many examples where Africa has African Union and African countries and African continent, I would say, have achieved some substantial results. Today, as I am speaking, out of 55 countries in the continent, just one missing country in Western Sahara, which is the last colony in Africa. So at least there is no more colonial presence as the case in the old manner. So we have now a problem between Western Sahara and Morocco, and African Union as well as United Nations are doing their best to sort it out. So on this ground of decolonization, Africa overall has recovered its independence. Of course, it's not enough. Now we have to get our independence in decision making. We have to get Africa, by the way, Clarice and my dear colleague from the panel, Africa is the rich continent in the world. When we look at all these natural resources, when we look at these resources, we understand very well how countries, rich countries, big countries are running to get access to Africa. China, USA, Russia, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and so forth. So we have our potential reserves. We need human resources to be activated and give a chance to our population to get the command. So I am very optimistic, but also equally realistic about the future of the continent. Of course, we have each of us has on his own responsibility. Of course, from me, I cannot live up to 2063, but right now I am doing my best to teach, to learn, to spread the information that Africa should recover its independence, should have its word, say in the world as well. And from this point of view, I am fundamentally optimistic. If you are optimistic, if you are caring for your own continent, and if you are really, truly believing in the Pan-Africanism, we should get involved. Doesn't matter how far, how big, how large it is, but we have to do it bricks by bricks, and that's what we want. And of course, we have to express, or we have to be proud of our self-dignity, self-independence, of course, decision making. That's exactly what we should do. We cannot just be doubtful about our capacity. I know Africa is equally, we have a lot of optimism, but also we have a lot of problems and civil war and conflict, border conflict, as it happened in the Great Lake, as it is happening now, as I said, in Western Sahara, as it is the case in South Sudan and so forth. But I am sure we have to have the political will and the moral and the ethical commitment and political commitment to do your best to improve lives of many, of course, 1 billion or so of inhabitants of continent of Africa.
Okay, which is a very imperative for ladies and gentlemen. If you are just tuning in, this is Global Insight brought to you by Globus, and we are today focusing on the Developmental Agenda 2063, which has already entered its second decade, and we're looking at how attainable or achievable it has been towards meeting its core principles or dictate of ensuring an integrated Africa, promoting Pan-Africanism, ensuring that there is, global or continental alignment to the African values, ensure that there is great transformation in the industrialization, look at the economy, which will be actually under the African continental free trade area, and other aspects or dictates under this. And now we continue with you, Najit. From what Professor Layit just mentioned, which I want to look at, we are looking at how maybe the subtle successes of that the continent has recorded as far as the Agenda 2063 or attaining the objective is concerned. And this will show to us that it is somehow slow because of the internal strife that we find today across the African continent. I would take, for example, since the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area till date, we'll note that the number of conflicts have actually increased across the African continent. We'll also note that a whole lot of the crisis have derailed continental projects where we see countries either they are focused more on trying to protect sovereignty, either due to internal dynamics or probably geopolitical or diplomatic dynamics, and then you see how the continent is tearing apart. Another key example is the fact that even under Agenda 2063, it was outlined that the African continent should be free from, proliferation of small arms. But then that was later postponed to another year because they could not attain that objective in 2020. So now it brings us to the aspect of how we can, handle some of these internal strife or problems which are impediment to a concerted or integrated agenda that seeks to position Africa not just best for Africans but best for the global world at large, and make the continent a major player in international decision-making table in line with economy, political sovereignty, and diplomacy, and we can name the rest.
Yeah, so very many questions and very interesting questions indeed. Yeah, but first of all, to be honest and fair, let us acknowledge first of all the milestones of the first decade between 2013 and 2023. 23. The African, for example, just I got some examples. The African Continental Free Trade Area has been signed by nearly all African Union members, right?
Absolutely.
A potentially historic step toward economic integration. Second, the single African air transport market has begun, enhancing connectivity. Or the Pan-African University is operational now, creating new academic collaboration. Or some member states have made progress on gender-responsive policies, youth, entrepreneurship, and digital inclusion. But, Clarice, so you introduced me as, as an expert in pedagogy and education, right? But I'm also a human rights defender and an activist in the civil society and a co-chair of the Tunisian Human Rights League, which is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate organization in 2015. So my duty here is to raise issues. So to raise the challenges we face and confront them directly, courageously, in order to work toward solutions with decision makers. Agenda 2623 remains feasible in principle, okay? But its realization is obstructed by enduring structural challenges. At its core, Agenda 2623 is an achievable and relevant framework. We all agree about that. Its goals align with the aspiration of African citizens for inclusive growth, human dignity, peace, and self-reliance. And I thank so much Mr. Aid who raised the issue of the Western Sahara, and I support, of course, the Western Sahara, and I thank very much Algeria for supporting these people. However, as we move through its second decade of implementation, the persistent gap between ambition and reality must be addressed with urgency and political honesty. So several obstacles continue to undermine progress. We should recognize that. Structural inequalities remain rooted in histories of colonialization, patriarchy, and class-based exclusion, continue to marginalize large segments of the population. Women, rural populations, persons with disabilities, and young people, especially in North and Sub-Saharan Africa, remain underrepresented in decision-making and disproportionately impacted by poverty. And security also, and lack of access to essential services. Without addressing these imbalances, development will remain uneven and exclusive. There is also weak political will at both national and continental levels. It remains a major barrier. While public commitments to Agenda 2623 are often made, the translation of those commitments into binding policy reforms, adequate budget allocations, and measurable indicators of progress is often lacking. In some cases, political expediency or centralization of power has led to the prioritization of short-term political gains over long-term structural transformation. I quote also, inconsistent implementation across member states is another critical challenge. Despite, of course, the availability of frameworks such as the first 10-year implementation, alignment between Agenda 2623 and national development strategies remains uneven. Some countries have fully integrated Agenda 2063 into their national agendas, while others treat it as an abstract or peripheral reference. Without a shared commitment to harmonization, the agenda risks becoming fragmented. There is also lack of inclusive governance, and citizen participation further deepens the disconnect. So Agenda 2063 clearly states that Africa's development must be, I quote, people-driven. Yet, in practice, is it really people-driven? Especially women, youth, and grassroots actors? They are not consistently engaged in the planning, implementation, or monitoring of Agenda 2063 goals. Civil society organizations, included feminist movements, are often excluded from official process or, in some contexts, actively repressed. The result is a growing credibility gap between the African Union's transformative rhetoric and the realities experienced by citizens across the continent. I apologize, Clarice, if I didn't really answer directly to your question, but I have to say that. So, I mean, it's very essential for me to mention all these issues.
Indeed, very essential. I think you answered the question in another way because we are still looking at the challenges that have made this the realization of the Agenda 2063 a subtle move, because it's supposed to be a radical move as per some pundit and as per the fact that dynamics are changing and narratives are changing across the Africa, to be able to have that full sovereignty of the African continent, especially economic sovereignty. There is need to ensure that we give more practicality to such a very feasible flagship agenda like the Development Agenda 2063. I think you just elaborated on some of the successes and challenges that we need to address as a continent. Every stakeholder, be it the local population, but particularly our political stakeholders and policymakers, because of course they are at the forefront to handle the diplomacy and every other thing pertaining the materialization of this agenda. And it brings us again to understanding with you, Henry Korm. We are looking at this flagship, development agenda, which has been highlighted by these the leaders. We are talking the African Continental Free Trade Area. You're so keen on how countries can probably use this to be able to have that economic prowess to solve many problems across the continent. So now, with all of these objectives aligned under the principles of the Agenda 2063, how then can you think Africans, leaders or stakeholders at every level can be more practical in utilizing the African continental free trade area to promote maybe regional and continental integration, and also continental transformation in terms of the GDP, economic growth, and probably intra-Africa trade?
Thank you very much for your question, Clarice. I think no continent across the world has grown without trading with themselves. If you look at intra-African trade, it's estimated at 16 to 18% of the total. Whereas if you look at intra-northern, if you look at trade between North American countries, it's estimated at about 45 to 55%. Trade between the EU is estimated at well over 65%. So Africa needs to do a lot more work. Africa needs to ensure that it's taking active steps to trade with its neighbors, because we cannot be trading with other countries across the world, but we don't trade between ourselves. If you look at the television screens which people are watching, the phones, etc., all of these electronics require rare earth minerals. Africa has 30% of global reserves when it comes to rare earth minerals. And so Africa can play an indispensable role in ensuring that the world transitions towards renewable energy and towards sustainable economies. But coming back to the AFCFTA, since the African Continental Free Trade Area was signed in 2018, several countries have now pardon me, several countries have now ratified the AFCFTA. I think in total, as of 2025, 54 out of 55 AU countries have signed, 43 to 48 countries have ratified, and over 36 countries have submitted the tariff dismantling schedule. So the AFCFTA is a flagship project from the 2063 vision that allows Africa to become much more integrated, accelerate economic transformation, especially because African countries actually trade more manufactured products and other goods. Over 46% of trade under the AFCFTA is in manufactured goods, which means that there is a potential for us not only to accelerate economic transformation and industrialize, but industrialize in a way that is conscious and cognizant of the challenges and difficulties facing marginalized groups such as women and youth. Of course, we still face no continent can develop without investing in infrastructure. Africa has a significant infrastructure deficit. We need roads, we need ports, we need railways, and of course, we need better accessible air travel. All of these factors, what does this mean? Africa is separated into 8 regional economic communities. You have the CEMAC in Central Africa, where I am. You have the Arab Maghreb Union up north. You have the SADC, Southern Africa Development Community. You have ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. You have the EAC. And the African Continental Free Trade Area actually doesn't come to put an end to these various regional economic communities, because some of them are very advanced. For example, East Africa and Southern Africa are much more integrated than Central Africa. The AFCFTA comes to ensure that each of these countries can leverage their neighborhood links and trade more between themselves, and also trade with other African countries. Now, unfortunately, the implementation of the AFCFTA has proceeded a lot more gradually than we would have liked. At the Cameroon Economic Policy Institute here in Yaoundé, we found that if we properly implement the African Continental Free Trade Area, Africa's GDP could rise by 2.4 to 2.5%. I think the World Bank equally shows that incomes could rise by, I think, 410 billion. But we at CEPI find with our reports that not only will incomes rise, wages will rise, standards of living will improve. And by lowering these barriers, it means that goods like flour, goods like, like popcorn and snacks like milk are going to be able to cross borders, and individuals and citizens will be able to afford it because the AFCFTA lowers the tariffs that importers have to pay when they buy goods from another country. And so it is revolutionary in itself, but again, it is the last trading bloc to emerge, but still covers over 1.3 billion people, and that's set to grow in the future. Now, a few countries in Africa already have acceptable levels of infrastructure. So the roads, the one-stop border post, the railways, and these countries have been included in the Guided Trade Initiative. These include countries like Morocco, Tanzania, Cameroon, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda. And this means that these countries and other countries can join, but these countries were some of the first to trade under the AFCFTA. Namibia recently sold a consignment of salt to Nigeria. And it's important that we in Africa continue to prioritize investment in value chains that will not only create local wealth, but also boost employment. Take cassava, for example. Across the continent, we all consume cassava, but this continent imports a lot of wheat from Ukraine, from Canada, and from European countries. Why can we not import some of the wheat, but also transition to cassava-based flour, to plantain-based flour? We at the Cameroon Economic Policy Institute, we are calling on policymakers to ensure that the infrastructure and the systems are in place to ensure that African countries can trade with each other. If I obtain the right permits and the right paperwork, I shouldn't be stopped at the border when I want to export to Nigeria or export to Ghana or Kenya. And so policy has a role to play. Policymakers, we need to move beyond the political will to thinking a lot more critically about how we want to integrate, because Africa has a number of trading corridors. If you look at the Northern Corridor, for example, which connects the port of Mombasa all the way to Burundi and the DRC, that could reduce, it has already reduced transit times by about 47%. You look at the Central African corridor that goes from Tanzania to Burundi and Rwanda, reaching all the way up to the Northern Corridor. We have to ensure that we need to move beyond talking just about infrastructure investment to making sure our policymakers set quantitative targets. If every African country today graded a minimum of 1,500 kilometers of road, or let's say 5% of their road network each year, then Africa would become integrated automatically. But we cannot continuously speak about the infrastructure deficit, talk about the unfairness of the global financial system, which are all factors that we have to give credence and credit to, without setting some targets for ourselves that we can hold, that we can use to hold our leaders to account. The corridors are important because countries have already formed, countries and trade networks are already formed around this corridor. So the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, for example, the Lagos-Kano, Karachi, the Beira, the Maputo, cutting through Mozambique and Zimbabwe, all of this is important for us to prioritize investing and improving these trade corridors, whilst also accelerating special economic zones. We've had them in Idea, in Douala, in Cameroon. We've had them in Lagos. All of our port cities shouldn't become hub for special economic zones. We should ensure that we aren't just copying and pasting, but ensuring that we develop the special economic zones where we have the capacity to develop them and improve. Finally, Africans have to start we have to start using our own currency. Gone are the days where I would want to buy some honey or some sandals from Algeria and I pay in dollars. No. Under the African Continental Free Trade Area, Afreximbank and the AFCFTA Secretariat, who have been doing a fine job, now have availed the Pan-African Payment System. The Pan-African Payment System allows a Cameroonian or a Kenyan to buy from Egypt or Mozambique and pay directly without any currency conversion cost. Because this currency conversion costs are costing the African continent about $5 billion every single year. And so our local producers who are already struggling to produce, to brand their products, to adhere to international norms, cannot be subject to additional tariffs. And so it's important for all African central banks, all African commercial banks, to accede to the Pan-African payment system to ensure that our traders can trade using their own currencies. I would like to remind our viewers that this is not an attack on the euro or the dollar. The dollar, the United States and Canada don't trade using the franc CFA or using the Kenyan shilling. Africa has to start trading using its own currencies, and the infrastructure is there. Now we need to move beyond political will, and commercial banks and central banks should begin using the Pan-African payment system such that our traders can trade better. Because once we remove these frictions, once we remove the barriers to trade, the barriers to human flourishing, the barriers to human prosperity, to entrepreneurship, then businesses are going to thrive. Businesses are not going to need to convert convert money into the dollars and then buy and then sell or buy from another country. If I may, finally, the African Continental Free Trade Area would only work if we have local policies that are intentional and forward-looking. We need to move beyond talking about economic transformation.
That is right, Henry. We are actually looking at how policy is affecting the continental project, and like you highlighted explicitly.
If I can just say just one thing in 1 minute.
Okay,
we also have
please.
to ensure that economic transformation is actually making sure that we no longer export our resources raw. We have to, the African Union should convince, of course, we shouldn't coerce, but we should ensure that countries understand that we have to transform our rare earth minerals before we export them to any country. Indonesia has taken steps to ensure that they process a lot more of their minerals. Africa has to ensure that we're no longer digging out things from the ground and exporting to other countries to manufacture and transform and sell us expensive phones and expensive gadgets. It's important for our economic transformation as well to be accompanied by a rethink of our human capital. We need to stop encouraging the use of ChatGPT and ensure that human capital reflects the needs of the labor market such that we produce some of the things that we consume.
Absolutely, it is very important, and I think it's normal to advocate, local policies or strategies that will help propel the African continent to bringing us to the Africa we want. We know that a lot is happening across the globe. We see how Trump, in his policy of wanting to make America great again, is doing everything possible and not apologizing. And I think advocating that Africa should use a local currency, shouldn't be a local or common currency, shouldn't be something that we're supposed to be apologizing. If we actually want to be the actor, it is imperative to start from within, take the resources, and this brings us to the question which I want to direct to you. Ultimately, we are looking at what has been highlighted by you, Henry, and other guests or maybe panelists regarding today's discussions. We want to relate mindset and the realization or the practical realization of Development Agenda 2063 and other maybe important continental projects that we see that they are probably moving slowly or subtly due to the fact that we somehow feel indebted to other countries. Like if we advocate more for this, we are going to be hurting China that we are trading with, we are going to be hurting the USA that we are trading with, or any other countries. How can we then adopt a mindset that will help us to align with the dictates of Agenda 2063 to be able to see very radical and positive transformations across the African continent?
Well, I've been looking at Agenda 2063 for a number of years now, and some of it is very discouraging. The fact that Africa has not emphasized, and certainly the AU, I should say, has not emphasized what Brother Henri is sharing with us, that we do need a more of a selfish, if you will, focus on what Africa has to do. The times are very urgent. The colonization of the African continent is a continuum. No one can deny that in reality. When we look at what the CA Frank is doing to the Francophone countries, when we look at what is happening in those countries that were former British colonies and the struggles that they're having with their predecessor colonial masters. When we look at what Germany is doing in the continent from an economic standpoint, and what many of the Arab countries have been guilty of more recently with the help of the United States and Europe to destabilize the Sudan, for example, through the UAE, and the belligerence of what is happening in Egypt in regards to the people who are in Gaza, and also what has gone on since Muammar Gaddafi was vanquished from Libya to the rest of the African continent. The destruction of infrastructure as quickly as it is built is a serious, serious problem on the continent. Yet the African Union, their number one agenda item is a high-speed rail network to link African capitals. How is that going to work? How is it going to work when you don't have the consolidation, you don't have the unity of function and purpose to even prevent one single conflict on the continent? You can't band together and stop the civil war that's going on in Sudan, which is the number one humanitarian crisis in the world today. It overshadows what is happening in Palestine and Israel, and it overshadows what's happening in Ukraine. We have serious problems on the African continent that are just being skirted over for the sake of local politics, local economics, and really small and petty things in the bigger scope of what should be addressed in Africa. The formation of transportation of economies. That's number 2 on the African Union's flagship projects that they want to undertake by 2063. These kinds of wordings and projects are more advantageous to exterior countries and models than to be able to address what is happening intra-Africa. And until consolidation becomes the buzzword, unity becomes the objective of all African countries. Every African state, all 55 of them, need to understand that you're not going to be able to unilaterally negotiate based on your individual country with the rest of the countries of the world successfully. You are always going to be at a serious disadvantage. Togo cannot negotiate with the US, just as Ghana can't negotiate successfully with China. Cameroon cannot negotiate with Germany, but as a grouping and as a consolidated force, you will have the kind of power and respect that's necessary to really be a factor in the world order that is structuring right before our eyes. So I would really like to see the agendas reworked, the priorities reworked for the African Union and for this Agenda 2063 into something that is more conducive to the needs of African people dealing with African problems.
Yes.
Many of the most serious challenges in Africa can be addressed very quickly through Ubuntu, through African principles of unity and Ujamaa and a number of other just basic African principles that we need to get back to, and they need to be the focus for how we're addressing this consolidation that is absolutely necessary and strategic for the future of Africa.
Understanding the narratives are across the African continent and being more intentional. I think this is the word that has been resonating across every sphere, pertaining to what is happening to Africa, or how Africa can actually, like you said, it's good to be selfish. And I remember, I think I will quote Arnold Davley, an international lawyer, who said that in diplomacy, accommodate is not a right word to use, but then you need to I think now that this is where that being selfish actually has a place to be able to meet that objective. And I think that is why the revolution across the 3 countries, Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso, has been welcomed largely across the African continent, because it takes just some positive selfish reasons to be able to attain an objective which very much stands to benefit the entire population of a continent that has been entangled for decades. And I think this is the new dawn for the African continent. With all that you have said, it is imperative ultimately that we now look at the politics in play as far as Africa's developmental agendas are concerned, and how the existing political sphere or scope is largely not helping the practicality of this agenda or development agenda. We want to look at the governance system, the political will, and even the political rhetorics. I want to look at how Africa's African politicians their rhetorics around politics have helped to even sideline or probably frustrate continental projects that stand to benefit the African people. And with you, Professor Laid Zaglami, we want to look at how, the existing political institutions, particularly what we are having in the 2025 in the 21st century, how it is these institutions have, and their dynamics are helping to stifle or to even frustrate the real functioning of this development agenda. So how has this, political institutions or mechanism have they been effective? If yes, let's try to understand how. And if they have not been effective, what else can be done to ensure that they are more present to probably ensure that we fast track the pace of the materialization of the development agenda? You are muted, please.
Prof. Laid, I think you're still muted.
Hello, Professor Laid. Please, you're muted. Yeah. We cannot hear you.
I think his mic may have a problem, but...
while waiting for him, I think...
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, yes. Okay, Professor Laid, you can go on.
Please, excuse me. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, Professor Laid.
Yes, we can.
Yes. What I am saying, of course, I do agree with Arthur to some extent, the point he made. But of course, you cannot overlook what is happening in Great Lake and in Sudan and as well as I said already in Western Sahara and so forth. But optimistic. You have to be optimistic, but equally realistic. We cannot cross your hand, do nothing. No, of course, facts are there. If you are making an assessment, you find out there are so many problems. But you have to be optimistic and you have to be active in your life. We should remember that in 1960s and exactly 1963, our leader, father, and elder of Africa, Julius Nyerere, of course, Ben Bella, Jamal Abdel Nasser, and so forth, have erected the African Union, the Organization of African Union.
Yeah.
Of course, it was a dream. Now, 2002, we have the African Union. So maybe the pace is very slow, but the fact, the political will is there. There are so many hard, there are so many difficulties. And why? Because some people, some countries, I would say, do not accept or are lacking democratic governance and so forth. And of course, maybe we have to put the blame on the leadership of African Union, which has done nothing to put in practice all the resolution and decision. We have all the...
He's frozen again.
Professor, please.
I think it's frozen. But so Professor Laid, was talking about the social dimension just now.
As Clarice said, we have all mechanisms. We have all the mechanism here and there, and unfortunately, those mechanisms are not implemented. Are not fully implemented. And if I don't want to single out any country, but some countries are acting for their own greedy interest. We've seen what happened last time in Washington when the President Donald Trump invited just 5 countries from Africa out of 55. Why did this country accept it? At the end of the day, got nothing. Because behind this meeting, and they were almost despised by the President of USA. I think the mindset, I would say, we have to be positive. We have to be proud of yourself. You have to be independent. Of course, realism is there. But you have to accept the fact that you should defend yourself. And Africa has all the potential to be, of course, sovereign, to be independent. They have the human potential, they have the resources, they have all the will, what they need, the political will and a firm commitment of their leader. And this is what is lacking. But I don't like to blame those who are or I would say I don't like to compromise the promising future of our generation of African countries. They deserve more than today. They will blame us. What have we done? We are, as professor, as scholar, as I would say analyst, etc. So we have to be practical, realistic, but not compromising when it comes to principles and values. So the blame, as once again, it has to be put on the African, the weakness of the African Union leadership. Now we have to, but nevertheless we have to be optimistic, because we have just elected a few months ago a new leadership. Well, let's keep finger crossed that the future will be improved, and of course all countries of African have to abide by working together and by all the principles and the constitutional acts of African Union.
Indeed, working by the Constitution of the African Union, being optimistic and being realistic, I think this is very important, and we need to reiterate on these very important key terms to ensure that we meet that agenda. It's not about being just positive, but then you need to work towards it and being real, attacking every barrier along the way, strategically, diplomatically, and otherwise to meet the objective. I will still come on the aspect of politics and governance. Let's take while Automobile was talking earlier on, he made mention of the crisis in Europe, and even Henry highlighted the fact that we keep importing wheat from Ukraine and other countries in Europe, whereas Africa can actually utilize its own resources for its full.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now the question is, we saw lately that President Donald Trump, I'm using Donald Trump because he has been the focal this point in contemporary time, during in wanting to bring forth his mega policies. And then we saw how he actually took some drastic moves of imposing tariffs. We know South Africa actually is under the sanction. I don't know, I'm sorry to call it sanctions, but the new tariffs, which many have seen that it will go a long way to maybe affect negatively the economy of South Africa and even trade between the two countries. We're also looking at India and other countries. But we also saw that Donald Trump, in his quest to meet his objective for the benefit of Americans, threatened Russian President Vladimir Putin, and saying that if he doesn't comply probably with the terms, maybe meeting to discuss the crisis with him, he is going to give more aid to Ukraine in line with the proxy war that is ongoing. Now, you see how these leaders have understood the narratives and the dynamics of their countries, and they are ready to fight for the sovereignty of their countries at any level. That threats do not mean anything to them. But when we come back to the African continent, like Professor Laid mentioned earlier on, when Donald Trump invited African leaders to discuss how immigrants can be sent to their countries, we saw the humiliation of that. It actually attracted some, let me call it debate across the African continent. And you ask yourself, you need a favor from Africa. Why not visit the African continent or the countries and, engage in these discussions to be able to meet that objective? And we know that the people of these countries like India, Russia, and otherwise, they already know what the country needs and the guiding principles or their values that they need to protect and curtail infringement of the external parties. But that seems to be lacking across the African continent, and that is why we are still where we are today. That was just an aside to bring us into understanding why the question of governance is important in ensuring that we meet the objective of the African Continental, Agenda 2063, which has entered its second phase. So how can we, bring Africans into understanding the importance of such an agenda through the governance system that we have in today's world with you, Najet, if you want to elaborate on that question.
For giving me this very difficult question, actually.
Widening the horizon, sorry.
Yeah, so I think, although, for example, let's start with Trump. Although Trump left office in January 21 and then went back, his America First, I quote, doctrine left a lasting imprint on USA-Africa relations. What I mean by that?
Yeah.
In 2025, the African diplomatic community and analysts generally reflect on Trump's Africa policy with a mixture of disappointment, concern, and caution. Why? First of all, there is the level of legacy of disengagement, I shall say, still felt. First of all, diplomatic disengagement under Trump, weakening long-standing partnerships with many African governments. Second, embassies and ambassador posts left vacant during his presidency led to reduced diplomatic access and influence. This is a fact. This is, I think, a very important fact. Late in 2025, several African governments are still rebuilding bilateral relations and seeking more consistent U.S. engagement under the Biden administration and its successor. So there is also a trust deficit, what I call trust deficit, a lack of trust. Trump's controversial rhetoric, such as referring to African nations in derogatory terms, left a deep wound in U.S.-Africa relations in opposition to Europe and France. Many African leaders and civil society actors distrust the possibility and renewed partnership under a second Trump presidency in 2025. This trust deficit has led African countries to diversify international partnerships, including greater cooperation with China, as it was mentioned before me, Russia, Turkey also, and the Gulf states, especially with Emirates. There is also the point of security only focus re-evaluated by Trump. Trump's emphasizes on counter-terrorism and military cooperation. Example, air strikes in Somalia, AFRICOM operations in the Sahel, etc., is now being debated across Africa. And many African states are increasingly advocating for comprehensive peace-building strategies that go beyond military solutions to address root causes of conflict, such as poverty, exclusion, and climate shocks, etc. We shall not forget also the economic impact. I'm not an economist, but I know that the economic impact here very important. The Prosper Africa still alive, but reformed. The Prosper Africa initiative launched under Trump has been revamped under Biden and continues in 2025 under a broader agenda of sustainable and inclusive trade, However, African stakeholders recall how Trump deprioritized development aid and focused narrowly on U.S. commercial interests, leaving fragile states and social.
Sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just tuning in, you're most welcome to this discussion, which is brought to you by Globus. This is Global Insight. We are analyzing or decoding the African Agenda 2063. The second decade was launched 2024 February. That will span from 2024 to 2033. But then we are looking at how realistic or practical it has been. Do we think that the successes that have been recorded so far under this agenda is actually worth mentioning, or there is much that needs to be done, especially in terms of governance across the continent to fast track this development? We want to apologize for that, and of course hoping that all is okay now with Najed, so we can continue with the discussions. While she will join us later, I think we can throw more light on this aspect of governance with you. I know you're an economist, Henry, but then economy works with politics.
Yeah.
How do you think?
Well, economics is very, very political, right?
Absolutely.
Dr. Najid said something earlier about it's important that when we're engaging in policy discourse or in advocacy, we have to make sure that it's inclusive.
Absolutely.
And if you, Professor Laid said it with a different iteration, that it's important to take this, it's important to have that confidence in being African first, in understanding that it's okay to fight for Africa's interests. And, Mr. Otto has spoken about how a range of malign influences means that even the way we interact amongst ourselves, with diplomacy, all of that is adversely impacted if we don't have a common vision. So I think when it comes to governance, of course, we at the Cameroon Economic Policy Institute are mostly focused on economic questions, but no economy has developed across the world without having good and effective institutions. The Nobel laureates for last year, I think it's Mr. Robinson and his friend, the Nobel laureates in economics showed clearly that countries who have better institutions tend to perform better because it's easier for reforms to diffuse through the economy. It's easier there's limited waste from investments that are either handled through corrupt means. There's fewer corruption, and so it's important for Africa to prioritize good institutions. Now, we are not a monolithic continent, and of course we're going to have there's going to be heterogeneity in how we develop. This is why the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, are going to develop from ECOWAS and Central Africa, because these countries, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you stand, have not seen a coherent democratic transition. And so this is one of the areas where democratic backsliding is caused by economic hardship, because usually people are able to justify democratic backsliding only when it's impossible for them to see major improvements in their standards of living. If you have countries where 40% of the population live on less than $1.30 a day, then that is unacceptable. When you have significant amounts of the population living on, when we give the $1.25 range, is the best of worst measures. But we have to ensure that people's lives are progressing in a way that allows them to contribute to democratic systems. If not, peace building efforts are going to be adversely impacted. The perception of risk, which I'm sure most of my panelists are aware, that there is something called the African risk premium. If you're an African country, you have to be twice as better to get half as much. The African risk premium means that it's much more expensive for us to borrow when African countries are downgraded. Before they are upgraded, it takes a very long time. And when African countries are apparently, according to the IMF, there's an unfair characterization or an unfair attribution of risk to African countries, which simply shouldn't be there. Because when you compare Africa to the United Kingdom or Japan, you'd find that most African countries, our debt to GDP ratios are much less than 60 to 70%. And yes, it's fair to say we are at risk. Some African countries are at risk of debt distress, one in three countries, the IMF will say. But for us, for you to say a country like Cameroon is at high risk of debt distress, I think misdescribes, because Cameroon has never defaulted on any of its debts, for example. And so merely placing it in a category that can compromise its access to finance in international markets defeats the purpose of leveraging international finance and tools to advance economic development. Now, this is not a criticism on the IMF or the World Bank, because I think we're past that. You know, it's about Africans taking responsibility for what needs to change.
Yes.
Before we talk about democracy, we have to ensure that citizens are engaged. African citizens need to engage with their domestic political systems, understand how much your local council spends, what their budget is, and how they're spending their budget before you can contribute to a global discourse.
Absolutely.
Important for that personal responsibility is the anchor for effective democratic institutions, because think tanks like us, of course, at the Cameroon Economic Policy Institute, we can publish reports on selected infrastructure projects. We consult on a range of climate projects, agriculture projects across the continent. But it's up to citizens to take an interest in how they're governed. And also, being, effective democracies will not only come from citizens. At the Cameroon Economic Policy Institute, we are also advocating that governments across the world, across Africa, learn from best practices. We should digitize as many administrative procedures as we can at the port, whether it's obtaining a license for a business or whether it's obtaining a specific document to be able to export or import. We have to digitize our procedures to ensure that there is limited risk of fraud and theft. If we allow people to handle papers and to continuously transact in cash, it would be difficult for us to eradicate corruption. We need to move to a paperless system that would limit the risks of corruption and allow Africa to develop truly. If I may, just the last point before I give the floor back to my co-panelists. I think for us, again, the trade is going to be an important determinant of Africa's future growth prospects. Africa will not develop simply by exporting natural resources alone. And when it's important that Africa needs to see itself as an example for other countries across the world. Because Africa is not the one imposing 30% tariffs on South Africa. Africa is not the one threatening over 100,000 jobs in South Africa due to tariffs, or Lesotho that relies on exports of garments and textile products.
Yeah.
Africa has benefited over a long time from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And come September, it's imperative for the US Congress to renew AGOA. It's important for Congress to take a stand for free trade because it benefits the United States from a soft power perspective, from a soft power standpoint.
Yeah.
But most importantly, if the United States and Western countries
should be rounding off, please.
Left a gap in the past, and China filled this gap. 14% of Cameroon's trade is with China. Over 65% of African countries now trade more with China than other continents like the European Union and North America. It's important that the North American countries and the United States in particular become a lot more strategic about how they engage with Africa. It shouldn't be business as usual. It shouldn't be leveraging the big stick of diplomacy to facilitate peace between the DRC and Rwanda. It should be about an intentional engagement. And we see examples from the United Kingdom, for example, who now has reduced tariffs on 6,500 products from across for many developing countries. This means, and an important aspect of this is that they are making sure that African countries, they've eradicated rules of origin, which means that African countries can now trade between themselves, transform products, import the mineral products from Ghana, import minerals from Cameroon, make a face mask and sell to Europe or the UK, and they don't pay any additional tariffs. They are prioritizing locally led development, and this is what we expect from our partners. It's not
That's
Africa has
of
been an
trade?
independent,
that.
has been an independent monolith for 50,000 years. It's never needed any outside help from anyone, and just until recently, because we deal with these kinds of local machinations, and we're trying to deal with Africa on too local of a level. Africa is a monolith. Africa is a continent that can compete with the world if it is allowed to consolidate and unify. Africa must unify.
Sure.
I often, Clarice, I'm sorry, I just felt like we
No,
were
just aligning with
losing
with
time.
what you said.
Uh,
No,
go
right
go
on,
ahead.
please. Right on, please.
Yes, what I was going to say was that when you look at a global map and you look at the continents in their context, and you say, what are the strongest, most powerful countries in the world? You come up with America, you come up with Russia, you come up with China,
Yeah.
you come up with Canada. And then when you look at the geography, these are the largest. The largest countries in the world are the most powerful. There is a direct correlation with the size of the geographic area that you govern to your power. Africa has a massive amount of potential in that respect. But Africa is fractionalized in 55 different directions, and people constantly talk about the diversity of Africa when Africa is not that diverse. Africa has always been a continent that you can go from north to south to east to west. You can travel easily. You can get there in caravans and move, and people have been doing that for thousands and thousands of years, and it has been self-sustaining. So Africa does not have to look outward for contract with Goya or with China or with anyone else for that matter, if the will is inherent for Africa to produce and trade internally.
That's true.
Turn all of those 55 countries into states,
But
and then
unfortunately, we cannot
operate as
live
a
in
federation of
isolation.
African states.
We
You
can't live in
cannot-
isolation, right? So we have to.
Yes,
in-
Henry,
But that's not
Henry, it's
isolation.
true,
We're not
it's
talking about
true.
isolation.
It's true we cannot live in isolation, and I think that Professor Patrick Lumumba of Kenya has always said that Africa cannot work in isolation. But then it's good to understand the dynamics. Know what is probably build an internal force that will help you give you a competitive edge to be able to meet up with your objectives, and that is why sometimes we see that we still have maybe delays in ensuring the real practicality of the Agenda 2063, be it the African Continental Free Trade Area or other aspects, because we look so much on the external ways of doing things without contextualizing, and that is why I want that we should end this this last phase of this discussion on looking at how we can now bring new strategies or propose strategies that suit the existing, forces on the ground to be able to position Africa well for the better realization of developmental agendas at every level. And that will be defined under its governance system and other, maybe the role of the civil society and every other African with this philosophy of Ubuntu and wanting to bring out the Africa we want. I think just 2 minutes you can conclude with what you've been saying. You were saying automobily.
So I think. Sorry, I thought that was me.
Let automobile can conclude with that.
I have just two
Yes,
recommendations from SIC.
we've got to look at Africa in a realistic world perspective. We cannot continue forward with this antiquated colonial mentality where we see Africa as a subdivision of all of these small countries that are trying to vie for attention from the rest of the world, saying we will dig up our countries and we will dig out our resources and we will trade them with you. We have to stop doing that immediately. Africa cannot afford to bleed itself any longer with that philosophy. And the only way that you're going to turn that around, and the reason the African Union is being rejected, the reason we have what is happening in the Sahel, we had 30 years ago a Southern Africa movement to do essentially the same thing. The only problem is that they were intermittent and they were truncated and thwarted by outside forces. Let Africa be Africa. There's nothing wrong with having an African continent that can function as its own engines, and it has the potential to do that. So that's all we're saying is allow Africa to take its center stage position as one of the most powerful continents and powerful countries. Get rid of all of these passports from all. One of the things that the AU says it wants to do is have one passport.
And that was actually launched.
In those terms, that is what makes the most sense. Mm-hmm. That is what's going to make the most sense for Africa's future.
Indeed, making sense for Africa's future, and I think you all have highlighted, to be able to fast track this development that Africa is in dire need of. It is imperative to cement the cracks within Africa and make Africa a strong force. I think still on this, let's go to Professor Laid. We'll come back to you, Henry, for you to present your argument or opinion pertaining still the dynamics at play, or what Mr. Otto Mobley advocated in his discourse. We are still looking at the governance structure in Africa, across the African continent. Let's come back to look at the political scene in Cameroon at the moment. You know, you see, wanting to elect, political stakeholders that will determine the future of the country, and sometimes it seems like it's a clown, a joke, and you want to ask yourself if some questions, if Cameroonians really know what it is vital for the country. And I think that is one aspect which all of you highlighted, that if Africans are aware of how important the developmental agenda is, if Africans are aware of their potential, it will help them to fight, to protect, and the politics that we have across the African continent, be it at the level of the AU or at individual levels, it will be that that will protect the interest and the vision of the African Union or African countries, be it Cameroon or Nigeria, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, not the one that will see countries in much discrepancies due to illogical or probably, I don't know the term we can use to define the type of politics across the continent that is helping to even stifle the growth, the steady realization of developmental projects for the continent, and particularly its youth.
That was a very long question, Clarice.
Actually, Professor Laid, we want to still look at the governance structure and how the political setting of Africa can help to redefine the trajectory for the full implementation of the African Agenda 2063 in this second era. Professor Laid.
Professor Laid is muted.
Please, you are muted. Can you unmute your mic, please?
Realism, realpolitik should be the guidelines of our policy for the future, for the near future. Of course, I understand how difficult to achieve the goals for 2063. There are so many difficulties. But if we are united, we can make a progress slowly but surely. And that's why the burden on the African Union is very heavy. And I think not only we have to expect from the African Union to be more practical, more effective, more interactive, but each country in the continent should also be put on pressure, pressurized by the civil society, by the elite, by the academics, by all the journalists. We cannot wait only for the political leader to decide for the continent. So this is important. I think the move has to be global and at different level of the continent, region of the country, as well as each country. That's why wherever there are some difficulties, the problem, intervention from USA, from here and there, still the future of Africa is within their own destiny, their own hands. They have to decide if they want to remove all colonial or neo-colonial mindset. So exactly, we in Algeria, we are proud of our independence because it was costly. That's why we don't want to collide with X or Y, but we are utterly, or I would say definitely committed to a Pan-Africanism to Africa. So we are giving the example, and that's what it is important that we should work towards these lines. I understand, as I said earlier, Africa has the natural resources, has the potential, has the stamina, has the power, has everything to act. I don't understand why some of the leaders of the continent are colliding with European, with Western countries at the expense of the unity and the cohesion and the noble, of course, values and principles of Africa. Africa deserves a lot of respect, a lot of dignity, a lot of independence, because they can be, as I said to you, a continent of the future. And I am reading a lot of literature on Western media. They are just giving a very gloomy image, and they do it in purpose to calm down or to despise the continent. But African countries should, by themselves, not be influenced or impacted by this negative narrative. They should be aware of if you do nothing, nobody will do it on your behalf. That's exactly what we should. I am confident the future will be bright for our continent.
Indeed, the future will be bright. I think while putting the philosophy of Ubuntu, it is imperative, I think, to also adopt the philosophy of Socrates that an unexamined life is not worth living. Man, know thyself. I think Africa needs to look within before extending without, to define practically and more optimistically the Africa we want. It may be in simple terms, but then with the geopolitical dynamics at play, with even the diplomacy that is changing at every level, it is imperative to look within, cement the cracks, as we highlighted earlier on, to be able to have this competitive edge to attain more milestones that will satisfy especially the youthful population of the African continent. That is the human capital, and that is why Professor Laid, of course, we do not undermine the role that the civil society, the media and other stakeholders need to play to be able to transform Africa. But then our main focus is on how the political dynamics of the continent is not helping to attain this objective, noting the crucial role that they have to play. I think you may want to throw more light on that, Henry Kwam, while maybe elaborating still on the points you wanted to advocate earlier on.
Yes, thank you so much for giving me the floor once more, Clarice. So if I may, I would just like to talk about the policy recommendations.
Sure.
At the Cameroon Economic Policy Institute, as you know, we've conducted research on the AFCFTA for all 54 African countries. And so what we found is that the problems that we face are the same across the continent.
Sure.
And so what we recommend are setting specific targets to improve our infrastructure, which means that every African country should be grading between 3 to 5% of its road networks each year. We should ensure that African countries work towards reducing the internet, the cost of accessing internet to make it easier for businesses to engage in e-commerce and digital trade. And secondly, we have to also accelerate special economic zones and make sure that those are built such that we can leverage current and future infrastructure. Thirdly, we have to harmonize fiscal policy across the continent. It's important that we identify a set of incentives that work for respective economies to ensure that businesses actually benefit from policy outcomes. And finally, fourth, we have to trade using indigenous currencies. We can no longer trade using international currencies alone. It's important for Africa to do so because it would reduce banking sector and financial stability risks. Finally, we need a much more rational engagement with our international partners. I think Africa is, we're at the precipice. Aid budgets are shrinking in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and it's important for Africa to not only talk about transitioning to trade and not aid, but making sure that we are taking credible steps, whether it's investment in human capital or digital and physical infrastructure, to ensure that we get there. And with our partners, we at CEPI continue to press for the types of engagements that allow a bit more flexibility, because African countries, again, like I said, are far from monolithic. Most 1/3 are at high risk of debt distress, and so it's important to make the relevant and the necessary allowances from a financial standpoint, but also from an economic and governance standpoint to ensure that African countries can converge and develop as they need to. My last recommendation is that every single African, whether you're a think tank, whether you're an economist or expert, whether you're a member of a civil society organization, every single African has to take the responsibility to work towards the development and the improvement of the continent. If we want to trade between ourselves, we should work on a daily basis to make sure it is a reality. And I think doing so and working with one vision will will ensure that we have this unified vision and prevent fragmentation, which has plagued the continent for such a long time.
Absolutely. Fragmentation, which is the problem. If we can close the gaps. Thank you, Henry. And to Tunisia with Najed, we are still looking at the way forward. We are aware of the dynamics in present the world, and how Africa is actually at the center of every changes happening, be it at the geopolitical level, diplomatic level, and how policy and maybe strategic level. So what in your perspective are those innovative strategies of that, or frameworks of that African Union and maybe other stakeholders across aligning under the Agenda 2063 can adopt to practically address the challenges which you had highlighted in the course of the conversation pertaining the continental free trade area, and probably holistically Agenda 2063.
Yeah, just one thing, the political will, and then the political will. Why? The political will of leaders and institutions is crucial for any transformative agenda, whether at national or continental level. Why? Because without it, even the best strategies, laws, or development frameworks remain empty declarations. Here is why political will is essential, especially in the context of Africa's development and Agenda 2063. First of all, political will translates vision into action. A strategic framework like Agenda 2063 offers a clear roadmap. Two, it ensures policy coherence and continuity. What I mean by that? In many African contexts, changes in government lead to policy discontinuity. So strong political will maintains long-term vision beyond electoral cycles, protects national development agendas from politicization or personal interests, ensures that reforms like gender parity, youth inclusion, or climate adaptation are not reversed. Three, the political will prioritizes the public good over political gain. What I mean by that? True political will means choosing justice over convenience, even when it is not popular. For it mobilizes resources and institutions, because political will unlocks public funding for social programs, institutional reforms such as judicial independence or decentralization, and support for marginalized groups, including women, rural populations, people with disabilities, and youth, etc. It also empowers civil servants and institutions to act effectively and with integrity. 5. Political will builds public trust and accountability. I spoke about accountability at the beginning of my intervention. Why? Because with political leaders, when political leaders show will to act decisively for the common good, citizens become more engaged. Civil society gains a space to collaborate. The democratic contract is strengthened. In contrast, the absence of political will often fuels cynicism, disengagement, and even unrest. Finally, political will determines success or failure of regional and continental agenda. How? Whether it is Agenda 2063, the African Continental Free Trade Area, or climate agreements, their success depends on strong leadership at national level, regional cooperation, and genuine commitment of implementation. Without political will, these agendas risk becoming symbolic rather than transformative. That's it, and thank you so much.
Fact are quite insightful. We need agendas that will meet the aspirations of the African people, building the Africa we want. And I think each passing day it is imperative for stakeholders to continue to define what is the Africa you want or we want. And if we know the Africa we want, we are going to work towards cementing the barriers or the challenges to ensure that we indeed have the Africa we want. A concluding phase with you, ultimately. Still on the strategies, the way forward, we've been reiterating all of these things, and when you go look across the sphere, across Africa, they still talk about the fact that we need to be more practical than theoretical. So aside the political will, what other strategic or innovative strategies can be adopted in this second phase of more, widen horizon for Africa can we adopt to benefit Africa, to ensure that it is no longer theoretical, but largely practical, a subtle process to transformation in Africa?
Well, we want to move with the agenda that we have, the tools that we have, the institutions that we have. We do have the advantage of being able to use the AU. And if we just looked at this 2063 strategy, but more importantly, look at the institution of the AU, if they are in fact wanting to, and they've got 15 different flagship projects that they want to institute. The problem with these 15 flagship projects is that they are deprioritized. They are out of sync with reality. The first thing being a high-speed train network connecting African capitals and commerce centers all across the continent. If, like I said before, if that is in fact a goal, it certainly has a couple of prerequisite steps that you have to take in order to do that. You can't go through war zones building a high-speed train. You can't cross borders of countries that don't want that kind of mechanization. And then you talk about transforming economies and for suppliers of raw materials. You talk about continental free trade. This is almost like it's been written by the EU. The Europeans have had a lot of influence in this document, and it doesn't really speak to the needs of African people on the ground. We know that by just the timber of it. And then when it gets down to things like, let's have one passport from one part of the continent to another, that makes sense. But in order to have one passport, you've got to move towards a consensus of unity. So once you have a consensus of unity among the people across the continent, which I know is already there because I've been all over Africa and I've seen it with my own eyes and listened to it with my own ears. People are unified. People want to be a monolithic continent. And it's the very best way to solve those problems that Brother Henri was talking about, where you've got these localized challenges and problems with that and problems with tariffs and those kinds of things. Why can't a country as strong as South Africa or Nigeria or Mali or Egypt, for that matter, be assistive to those countries that are on their borders that are having serious famine problems and poverty issues and movement of water and things that are just so basic? Why can't those countries convene and help the smaller countries? The reason they don't is because of this really backwards colonial strategy that is still in place, this neo-colonial overlay on Africa that is still in place, that really has to be done away with. And so Africans have to get to a point, even at the African Union, because they were there 70 years ago at the Casablanca conference where Kwame Nkrumah and Gabon Nasser and other progressive leaders from Algeria and Guinea-Bissau and other places sat together and said, this is what we need to do. That was 70, 80 years ago. So these aren't new fixes to these old problems. We have the tools to do this. But like my sister said, we need the political will. We need the political will to correct these problems. And we need to fix them very quickly, because otherwise Africa will continue to be exploited, particularly by Western countries and the Europe who are standing by to do and continue just that effort.
We need to align on the preamble of the Africa. We weren't defining it practically, and also ensuring that we put the necessary tools together to attain that objective. And this will go a long way if we write the narratives for the African continent, narratives that are practical, contextual to the realities of the African people. And this brings us to the role of the media, and which Professor Laida will conclude this discursive program with maybe strategies or innovative strategies that can be adopted by the African media to ensure that we educate Africans more, to widen the horizons, to help them, especially the youthful population across Africa, to understand the needs of the continent, so that they can align, with these, strategic or blueprint agendas set under the auspices of the African Union for the African people.
Yes, thank you very much, Clarisse. Well, fundamentally, what I need as Algerian and fundamentally Pan-African, I want a continent free of war, of conflicts, a continent for prosperity, a continent for freedom, for democracy, for security, and a continent which has to impact the world, as I said already, geopolitical card. And this is what we should do. And of course, we have to convert words in deeds. And the social, the civil society, the academia, the elite should be putting pressure on their leader, and the leader should remove all their narrow-minded interests. They should also think globally, act globally. Of course, think globally and act sometimes locally, regionally, but it is all for the interest of the continent. We, 2025, we have the historical responsibility of to put into practice what we can do right now. And as I said, Agenda 2063, it's a long process. It is not easy one. But please, for God's sake, as already Mrs. Najat has said, we have to have the political will to do something practical, because our audience, our population is waiting for something practical. And as I said already, Africa has the human potential, has the material, has the natural resources, has everything to succeed. Please remove from our mentality the colonial aspect, the neo-colonial aspect that we have been nurturing so far. And of course, we have to get into partnership. It's not a question of isolation or no. No, we have, of course, Africa is open to all great powers. Can you imagine right now, 55 countries in this continent, no single country is a member of the Security Council. This is injustice. We inherit from injustice. So keep fighting, keep setting our mind on the positive, on the progressive, and I'm sure in the end we get at least, we have to meet our expectation, our needs, and the next generation will move on for 2063. Thank you so much, Clarice.
Thank you so much. It's about the intentionality, and to have the Africa we want, I think we need to change Africa with knowledge, widening the horizon, bringing about understanding, ladies and gentlemen, across the African continent, and seeing how it is imperative to cement the gaps or maybe discrepancies across the political lines, economic lines, social lines, and you can name the rest, to be able to fast track the development agenda 2063. We need to think globally and then act sometimes locally. I am borrowing the words of Professor Laït Zaglami. I want to extend gratitude to you, esteemed guest, for your input on this important topic that decoded the principles of the Africa's Agenda 2063, which actually is a flagship agenda for the continent, with potentials to transform Africa and have the Africa we want, not just in words or theoretically, but having the Africa we want practically, that will reduce youth unemployment, that will reduce the fact that maybe the heinous activities or perilous journeys that young Africans embarked on in the Mediterranean, with the mindset of searching for an El Dorado in Europe or probably in the West, but then understanding the value of the continent while collaborating with the global world at the same level for the benefit of mankind. Just to reiterate again, ladies and gentlemen, that this program was brought to you by Globus, and Global Insight seeks to provide a platform for discuss, analysis, knowledge sharing, and of course opinions that will help reshape the world, particularly Africa and the global world, in this moment of great narrative shift and in the world of heightened multipolarity and multilateralism. Thank you so much to the technical crew also for ensuring that it was a smooth program. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and we take another rendezvous shortly, maybe in the days ahead, to continue to talk things that matter, and at the end we are going to meet the objectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you.